have Dr. Andrew Novo. He is an assistant professor of international security studies at the National Defense University. He studied classics at Princeton University before getting a master's degree in international relations and a PhD in modern history from St. Anthony's College, the University of Oxford. Dr. Novo has also taught at Georgetown and lectured at the University of Cyprus and the United States Military Academy at West Point. I thought about striking that from his bio, but come on now. There are brothers and sisters. Okay. His research interests include ancient and modern Mediterranean history, grand strategy, American foreign policy, and military history. He has published 2 books: When Small Countries Crash in 2011, which details the financial crisis in small economies, and Queen of Cities, a historical novel of the fall of Constantinople. Let's provide Dr. Novo a warm Naval Academy welcome.
Thank you. So I would like to thank the Naval Academy for hosting me today, for all of you for showing up, Keith for an excellent introduction to the post, Mark for all his assistance in helping make today's presentation possible, and my friend Dr. Hayden Bellenoid, who may be a professor for some of you, who was responsible for my invitation to come and speak here today. So when I was asked to come and speak about NATO, I made something of a resolution to myself that I would try to avoid cliches. NATO is, after all, an organization prone to cliches. NATO's function has been captured by the cliche of keeping the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Other cliches, of course, include the characterization that NATO is an organization forever in crisis, or a collection of partners looking for an identity. So my goal was to write a talk which would not approach NATO from these well-trodden paths. But I have to confess that I failed miserably. And I failed because the issues which these faithful platitudes represent remain with us. And the logic which underpins them exerts a powerful influence on NATO's present and on NATO's future. So since I can't avoid the cliches entirely, what I want to do is to try and unpack them a bit, to move beyond the banalities and to explore some of the enduring and emerging themes about NATO and hopefully prompt some thought and debate about this remarkable organization and the broader implications it has for American foreign policy and global security. I want to address the reasons for NATO's creation and the changes which have redefined the world since then, and how those changes affect NATO before looking at where NATO goes from here. So how did we get here? What about the cliche about NATO's formation and design? What's behind that? So to say that NATO was designed to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down has numerous implications if you start to think about what that sentence means. I would say that it implies, number one, that Russian dominance of the European continent is unacceptable. It implies that the United States is necessary to ensure a European balance of power or to underwrite European stability. It implies that German hegemony in Europe is equally undesirable to Russian hegemony and is something which policymakers in other nations must work against. But whose perspective does this analysis represent? I would argue that it is actually primarily a British analysis. And indeed it was Hastings Lord Ismay, the first Secretary General of NATO, a British general, who described NATO in these now famous terms. For 500 years, British grand strategy and foreign policy was geared toward preventing the establishment of a European hegemon. In that cause, the British allied with the French against the Spanish, with the Spanish and Germans against the French and Italians against the Germans, and then with the French and Russians against the Germans and Italians. In another flip, Britain allied with the French, Germans, Italians, and Americans through NATO against the Russians. So the Americans were necessary in this final stage because Britain no longer possessed the military and economic capabilities to ensure a balance of power on the European continent. This analysis brings us to the conclusion, one supported by the historical record, that NATO was largely a European creation. Most of the critical initiatives which led to the creation of NATO took place in Western Europe rather than in the United States. The United States, historically reluctant to become involved in permanent alliances and with a tradition of isolationism, had to be convinced that such a project was both feasible and worthy of its attention. So as we consider this analysis today, there are important follow-up questions which come from this. What are the prospects for and threats posed by a European hegemon today for American interests? Is the United States still necessary to ensure security in Europe? Does Russia represent the same kind of threat to Europe's political and economic system in 2015 that it did in 1945? So I will try to use the rest of the talk to explore these questions and provide both direct and indirect answers to them. So to start with, I'd like to explore the number of ways that the world has changed since the North Atlantic Treaty was signed in Washington in 1949. There are three absolutely critical changes which have taken place since 1949, and it could be argued that in terms of NATO, they're almost of equal importance with each other. The first, of course, and most obvious, is the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is important in geostrategic terms because Russia is, and is likely to remain, far less powerful than the Soviet Union was. The Soviet Union was a direct peer competitor with the United States in a number of ways. Russia today has a population smaller than Bangladesh and an economy smaller than Italy. Just think about that for a second. At the same time, Russia is not the ideological force which the Soviet Union was, particularly under Stalin. It has no aspiration to spread a radical political system across the world, and whatever political system it holds has little to no appeal for most of the people in the nations of Europe. From this macro perspective, it seems almost absurd to imagine Russia achieving political control over countries in the European Union. This brings me to the second critical change, which is the economic and political landscape of Europe itself. Europe had been devastated by the Second World War. Entire populations had been murdered, imprisoned, or became refugees. Victors and vanquished alike were bankrupt. Any of you have studied the history of post-Second World War Europe, or even Second World War Europe, you start to understand this. Just as a small aside, an anecdote, one of my good friends growing up and a neighbor of mine is a veteran of the Second World War, and he was in Holland. And he told a story that the Dutch were so poor and so hungry in 1944, 1945, that they would go to the American base where our guys were peeling potatoes, and in the trash bin where the potato peels were, they would reach in and take out the potato peels and the other refuse from our kitchens and take them home and cook them and eat them. Okay? So we're dealing with a continent which was completely and utterly devastated, and the governments of those countries were bankrupt. There were genuine fears in countries like France and Italy that local communist parties would take advantage of this turmoil, and also, keep in mind, the political discrediting of almost all the parties on the right to achieve some sort of political revolution. For all the problems swirling around Europe today, unemployment, the crisis in Greece, public debt, confidence in the euro, they do not approach the catastrophic dislocation, physical destruction, and social cleavages of the 1940s. Europe is a powerful political and economic entity today. The European Union has more people than the United States. Its combined economy is larger than the United States. Together, the nations of the EU are far more powerful than Russia on those metrics and more. And Europe has been mostly at peace for more than half a century. And this is the substance of what I would say is the third critical change. The geopolitics of Europe have changed along with Europe itself. The balance of power politics which defined European international affairs for hundreds of years is less prevalent now than at any point in the continent's history. A European war, like the First or the Second World War, is highly unlikely. For more than 40 years, NATO was central in providing the deterrence necessary to avoid a third conflict of a similar scale. It was critical in furthering a unified American and European interest in avoiding that sort of war. This interest, of course, endures, but the likelihood of such a conflict has been greatly reduced. The German problem or the German question about how a strong, unified Germany could be integrated into a broad European system without conquering Europe in its name has been attenuated by fundamental changes within the German political landscape, German demographics, and the deep relationships and power-sharing structures established by the European Union. Europe has also expanded, pushing its limits to the borders of Russia, bringing under its aegis former Soviet clients and former Soviet republics. It has fundamentally changed both the borders and the nature of Europe. So this is the new world that NATO has to navigate. In this new world, how are we to understand the interests of the various NATO nations? In that context, what are the interests of the various NATO nations? Do the interests that brought them together in the 1940s and 1950s still apply? Part of the answer to these questions and others lie in how we define those interests, both historical and contemporary. The United States was interested in containing the spread of communism to Germany and to Western Europe. Are we as interested in containing Russian power in Eastern Europe? Current NATO members and aspiring nations have different objectives. In the old days, Britain pushed for NATO, and France accepted it, as a way to prop up their key strategy of preventing another country from dominating Europe. Britain and France twice fought with the Americans and Russians against the Germans to prevent this from happening. From 1949 onward, they signaled a willingness to fight with the Americans and eventually with the Germans against the Russians to prevent this from happening. Western European nations feared communism and Soviet expansion during the formation of NATO, and they were concerned with Russian expansion. It should come as no surprise that France has been one of the most cautious voices with regard to Russia over the Ukraine crisis. As early as the 1950s, France began to feel as if they no longer had reason to fear a communist or Soviet takeover, and softened their policy toward the Soviet Union as a result. There's also some historical debate about how pulling out of Indochina at the same time may have also wanted to avoid creating waves with the Soviet Union. NATO's expansion, particularly its move east to the borders of Russia, demonstrate a critical way in which the interests of NATO partners have changed over time. The new NATO nations, on the other hand, have a more immediate and personal perspective on Russian power. Today, there are concerns on Russia's periphery from smaller nations, Estonia, Latvia, Georgia, and even some bigger ones like Poland and Ukraine, about the need to restrain Russian power. These countries, I would argue, have two primary objectives. First, leaders within those countries wish to avoid becoming Russian satellites. Second, they wish to continue domestic reforms and move their domestic societies away from their Soviet past by developing critical institutions, political freedoms, and economic transparency. For these countries, NATO is a security guarantee, a preservation of their independence both literally and figuratively from Russian aggression. But NATO is also a tool for internal development. For these countries, NATO membership is a tool, but is using NATO as a tool for domestic evolution a sufficient cause to unify the diverse nations which now constitute this alliance? Bismarck, the great German politician, some of you may have heard of, anyone not heard of Bismarck? Okay, thank God. Okay, so Bismarck is supposed to, you guys are doing a good job. Bismarck is supposed to have said that the whole of the Balkans was not worth the life of a single Pomeranian grenadier. By that logic, is Estonia or Latvia worth the life of a single French legionnaire? Certainly, the recent crisis over Ukraine would indicate that French political leaders believe that they're not. President Hollande publicly stated not so long ago that NATO expansion should be halted, in spite of the clear commitment of Article 10 of the Washington Treaty, which says that membership is open to any European state which can contribute to the security of the North Atlantic area. Demonstrating the ability to contribute to the security of the North Atlantic area, I would argue, is one of the key motivations for countries like Georgia, for example, to contribute troops in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Georgian soldiers have been in Afghanistan since 2004. Between 2004 and today, some 11,000 Georgian soldiers have served in Afghanistan. Since 2010, they've suffered 29 killed and more than 400 wounded. So having already brought 12 former Soviet and Warsaw Pact nations into NATO, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland in 1999, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia in 2004, and Albania and Croatia in 2009, there are only a few fault lines left between Russia and NATO. One is Georgia, another, of course, is Ukraine. While those new NATO countries have demonstrated a robust commitment to the social, economic, and political progress and the security offered by NATO, more established NATO countries in Europe, along with more isolationist American voices, have been more skeptical. And you can hear this debate if you pay attention at all to the sort of political discourse that goes on in think tanks and events. In Washington, you get a couple people from a think tank together, and some of them will say, well, why is NATO in Estonia? Who cares about Estonia? Estonia shouldn't be part of NATO. They don't give us anything, and they're just a threat to us. You know, it's bad to have them in NATO. So you have that more isolationist American voices are skeptical of it, and of course, Western European nations are also more skeptical of what utility these countries could be, because they view the utility of a small country like Estonia or Georgia within the alliance to be far less than the risk of Russian anger that partnering such a country entails. A rosy view of NATO, which emphasizes the deep cultural, historical, and economic unity of Europe and the United States, I think can be overdrawn. There are differences in both perspective and perception. The overlap of American and European interests can be overstated, particularly if we make the mistake of treating Europe as a single geopolitical actor. As Europe has expanded, its strategic interests have changed. Reconciling the different imperatives of Europe's diverse member states remains a critical challenge for the EU economically, politically, and strategically. Any discourse of division within Europe or between European partners and the United States invariably leads to the question of crisis, another one of those persistent cliches I warned about in my opening. Speaking about a crisis in NATO is somewhat ahistorical. The organization has always been in crisis. It was in crisis in 1952 when the United States expanded to Greece and Turkey, perennial enemies with weak economies on the very fringes of Europe. It was in crisis in 1954 when a French initiative to launch a parallel European defense force in order to undermine American influence nearly came to fruition. It was in crisis in 1956 when British and French forces, in conjunction with the Israelis, launched an invasion of Suez and were humiliated into abandoning their project by economic threats from the United States. It was in crisis in the 1960s as America escalated the Vietnam War and France developed its own nuclear deterrent and withdrew from NATO Central Command. It was in crisis in the 1970s when European powers believed that détente with the Soviets would undermine America's strategic commitment to Europe, and when Turkey invaded the island of Cyprus. In response to that invasion, Greece withdrew from NATO Central Command in 1974, rejoining only in 1980. NATO was in crisis in the 1980s with American involvement in the war against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, which many European leaders thought was provocative, and with a more aggressive American posture regarding the use of nuclear weapons within Europe against a Soviet invasion. It was in crisis when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990-91 and seemed to have no further purpose for existing. It was in crisis over the invasion of Iraq in 2003, when it was divided into two diametrically opposed blocs. It was in crisis over the war in Georgia in 2008, and continues in crisis over the current violence in Ukraine. So I don't want to say that we should take NATO for granted, though, that it can weather all these crises, and so it will continue to weather crises. But it is possible that over time the organization could weaken or disintegrate. But we should also recognize its resilience and respect its durability. NATO has proven durable because the core interests and beliefs it reflects continue to be relevant today. NATO was born from the same practical idealism forged in the furnace of the Second World War, which gave rise to the United Nations, the Bretton Woods economic system, and the European Community. The Washington Treaty's preamble announces to the world that the signatories are determined to safeguard the freedom, common heritage, and civilization of their peoples, founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. This broad and normative mandate, beyond the physical goal of constraining Soviet power, represents a key aspect of NATO's identity. For these reasons, it has kept its doors open to new members. For these reasons, it has developed new areas of operation and carries out missions both under its own Article 5 for collective security and under UN mandates. NATO, as we all know, operates in Afghanistan to oppose the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. It carries out what it calls peace support operations in Kosovo, which began in 1999 and in which it deploys approximately 4,500 soldiers. NATO carries out counter-piracy operations off the Horn of Africa. It monitors the Mediterranean for issues dealing with immigration, organized crime, and drug trafficking. And NATO also supports various stability operations in Africa. Its commitment to freedom, democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law continue to define it in a post-Cold War world. This identity makes it appealing for countries which aspire to emulate these values, just as it makes NATO a target for those countries which reject both these concepts and the manner in which the alliance expresses them. NATO is an affirmation of American and European solidarity. It is a commitment to our most fundamental beliefs. It has proven a remarkably successful guardian of peace in Europe, and hopefully it will continue to fulfill these roles. Hopefully it will continue to develop so that it can survive for another 6 decades and beyond, and the world will be a better place for it. So we should do some questions if you're interested.
Let's ask a couple of minutes to make sure you guys have been paying attention.
So before we start the questions, I just want to say that I had to bribe everyone very heavily to get you pizza. In order, and I did that for 2 reasons. Number one, so that you would stay awake, because I found in a long and partially undistinguished academic career that if you're chewing, you can't fall asleep, or it's much harder to fall asleep while you're chewing. And the second idea was that it would put you in a positive mood, so that it would be a much more enjoyable experience for all of us. So.
Nice carbo load for the rest of the day. So, who's got the first question?
Sure. It's Aaron Hall from Seventh Company. I had a question about, with regards to the recent just capital outflows from the Eurozone, the weakness of the Euro recently. How do you think it's best for us to proceed in keeping NATO members like prioritized on European security when they're going to have difficulties economically?
Sure, that's a great question, and it's something that it's another one of the current cliches, right? One of the current big discussions around NATO is budgets. How do you reaffirm your commitment to security? How are you an effective force for good in the world if you're cutting your budget? And lots of big NATO countries are cutting their budgets. I think the question becomes, it's twofold. The first part of it is what you actually expect those nations to do. So take, for example, the example I used of Georgia. Georgia has a very small military. It has a very small military budget. But I believe it put 2 combat battalions in Afghanistan. And that was a pretty large commitment. So even if you reduce your military budget, you can still maintain a force that can be effective for the kind of missions that you want. A couple of months ago, the commander of the Greek army visited NDU where I teach, and so we had him in a classroom like this. And he said, well, my budget's gone down by 30%, but I still have to do all the things I have to do. So there will be reductions, but it doesn't change the fact that armies will still have to function. I think one thing we should be cautious of is assuming that there's some sort of magic defense number. That just because you cut your budget, that doesn't mean that the number you were at is the magic number, right? That you'll be completely dysfunctional if you go below that number. The second piece of it is the perception of the threat. Yeah, it's something I tried to touch on in my talk, but we are in a different security environment today than we were in 1950. So the French and the British and even ourselves, we're not going to build tens of thousands of aircraft and hundreds or thousands of tanks because we're going to engage in a big battle with the Soviet Union in Germany. And so for European nations, they're going to have to think of, they're thinking of the threat differently. They're not thinking of a giant conventional war with Russia. They're thinking about deploying a combat battalion or a regiment here or support stability operations there, and so they will mold their force posture to that, to those needs.
Sir, you mentioned, first class Simon, you mentioned that Russia was not really interested in invading Ukraine to sort of bring back it's not trying to promote its Soviet Union ideas onto Europe anymore, and they're not interested in it. But is that to say that Russia is invading Ukraine purely for resources, or do you think part of it could be sort of the idea of bringing back like the good old days of the Soviet Union, even though the reality of the good old days of the Soviet Union might not really be what they think of it? If that makes any sense.
No, that makes sense, and I would say that that's an important issue, and I want to clarify, I guess, what I said. My premise was that Russia today is not the Soviet Union, and it doesn't have the same kind of appeal that nations in the west of Europe, like France or Italy or Portugal, are not going to be afraid that tomorrow they could wake up in a communist country. They're not going to be afraid that there will be a force-on-force confrontation in their home country or a domestic political revolution in their home country. Because in 1950-51, in Italy or France, this was a concern. Ukraine is a different issue. And that gets to the core of highlighting what I tried to talk about in the second half of my talk about the different perception from more established NATO members and new NATO members or aspiring NATO members. Because a country like Estonia feels very acutely, well, tomorrow there may be Russian soldiers or non-Russian soldiers here, or some sort of other disruptive force. If you're in Paris or Rome or Madrid, the question becomes, do you care enough about that to want to do something? Or do you look at that and say, you know what, no, that's off my radar. That's far away. It's what was the famous quote from Lloyd George, or one of the British guys on the eve of the First World War said, it's a distant quarrel in a far-off land that we've never heard of. We're not going to fight and die for it. So I think it's a really important distinction. It's not that Russia doesn't want parts of Ukraine. It does. It's the function of the mainstays of NATO America, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, don't look at those countries which are now on what you might call the periphery and think of them critically, as being critical to their interests. Whereas in the past, West Germany thought, we have to join NATO because, you know, there are all these armed East Germans and there are all these Soviet troops. They could be here tomorrow, and we don't want that.
Okay.
So I hope that,
Yeah, that
yeah,
clarifies it.
yeah.
Thank you.
Sir, Bishop the Second Class Smith. You commented on maybe perhaps a clarification on this. I've heard mumblings amongst multiple different venues that the U.S. should be somewhat questionable or questioning of how we move forward with our military policy in NATO, given that it almost seems that those peripheral countries that you're talking about are scaling down their military budget, scaling down their military power, because they say, oh, well, the mainstays of NATO, Germany, Italy, France, the UK, and the US, will always stay powerful because we are the quote-unquote superpowers, and if anything bad happens to us, well, they'll just step in and act in our favor. Is that something that you've seen, or how do you perceive that thought process?
Well, I think what's happening is the crisis in Ukraine has sort of confronted countries that are on the border with Russia, whether it's Estonia or Poland. They are now increasing their defense spending. Sometimes small, but they're increasing their defense spending. Countries like France, I believe that the defense projection from 2015 to 2016 for France is that it's going to be level. Germany and Britain are decreasing it a little bit because of economic issues. But the countries on the front line are going to increase it. I think it was Estonia actually, or maybe Latvia, that actually brought back national service. That now, yeah, these countries had gotten rid of conscription, and now they're bringing it back. So that is going to change over time. For the United States, I mean, to take your question in a slightly different direction, which people may be interested in, for the United States, the big question is, how do we maintain an Atlantic European alliance and the concomitant commitment of resources at the time when we're supposedly pivoting to Asia? That we're going to become, that we want to look at the Pacific as being the primary area of focus, because this is a huge geostrategic change for the United States, right? For the last 100 years, we were concerned about what happened in Europe. And primarily, for the first half of the 20th century, it was Germany in Europe. For the second half of the 20th century, it was Russia in Europe. But it was still Europe. Now there is a debate, an internal debate in the United States. Can we do both at once? Or are we going to have to choose that we're going to sort of leave Europe on its own because it's not as important, and we're going to have to focus on Asia? And there are macro debates that go on with this, like population and economic numbers, for example. They say, well, the population of Europe is declining. Economically, Europe is going to be overtaken by China. The new markets are all in Southeast Asia. So that's where we have to look for the next 100 years. So that's also part of a bigger debate here, bigger internal debate.
One more question.
Sir, you mentioned that there were those in the United States and Western Europe who argue against NATO expansion because they don't want to risk angering Russia.
Yes.
What's the counter-argument in those countries? Is it that Russia won't do anything, or that anything they do isn't going to pose a threat?
So the argument is, there are a couple of pieces to it. The United States and Russia, or the Soviet Union, we have a history of promising things to each other and then kind of reneging on our promises a little bit. So the Soviet Union, for example, promised that there would be free elections in Poland. There weren't. The communists just came in and said, oh, Poland, yeah, it's ours. Oh, and Britain, remember you fought Germany to ensure free Poland? Forget it. It's going to be ours. We said, well, there are going to be free elections in Italy. And then the CIA pumped about $5 million into the Italian elections, so the communists lost. When the Soviet Union fell, we actually promised Russia, don't make any trouble, we won't expand NATO. In 1999, we expanded NATO. In 2004, we really expanded NATO. And we not only took, as I said, former Soviet clients like Poland, we took former Soviet states like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So the argument goes something like, well, if you don't if you don't want to antagonize Russia, if you don't want to make Russia feel like it's surrounded, I mean, I could put up a map, which would be kind of interesting. You know, like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all part of NATO. Norway, part of NATO. Poland, Czech Republic, NATO. Turkey, NATO. And then American bases in lots of the stands, American army in Afghanistan, American allies in South Korea, Japan. If you look at the map and if you put yourself in the mindset of Russia, you look, I'm surrounded. That's not good. You know, has anyone ever played a board game, like a war board game and played as Germany? Anyone nerdy enough to admit it? Okay, good job. It's okay, right? If you've ever played a board game, like a 20th century board game as Germany, when you set it up, you become paranoid. You become paranoid. There's no other way to be if you play as Germany, because you look at the map and there are French armies and British armies and navies and fleets, and they control India, and then you have China, and you look around and you go, oh my God, I'm surrounded. There's Russia. What else can you be but surrounded, right? So the counter argument is that by pushing the borders of an alliance, you will make Russia nervous. And this is classic, for those of you, anyone studying international relations, like international relations theory, this is classical realism. This is not literally classical realism, but it's a classic realist argument which comes from the security dilemma. And the security dilemma says, I want to be secure. You want to be secure. That makes sense. The system is anarchy. No one's going to protect us. So in order to be secure, I have to build my military resources. I build my military resources not because I want to hurt you, but because I want to protect myself. But you don't know that. And you can never be sure of my intentions. And as a result, you build up your military resources to protect yourself from me. But I look at you building up your military resources now, and I start to get afraid. And so now we have a problem. Because you have weapons and I have weapons, and I'm afraid of you and you're afraid of me. And according to John Mearsheimer, coined this as the tragedy of great power politics. Now we compete, now we get into conflict, even though all we really wanted was to be secure to begin with. So that's the counter argument. And it's actually interesting because we may think of this European approach as a softer approach or a more liberal approach. It's actually a realist approach. If you build it near Russia, they will get nervous, and then you will have unintentional conflict. You're setting yourself on a road to conflict.
With that, let's thank Dr. Novo for his time. We've got the ubiquitous Naval Academy gift of the photo album here we wanted to give you. Thank you for
very
your
much.
time today.
Thank you.